Hello, I'm Rupert.
Yeah, I'm Roger.
And we're here today to have a dialogue about movement strategy, talk about some matters of common interest that maybe will interest you.
Well, we've been trying to plan this for 6 months, haven't we? So we've finally done it. And yeah, what I wanted to say was, obviously we're just talking for ourselves, aren't we? We always have to say that. And if people don't want to watch it, that's fine. There's no pressure. And also I wanted to say, I think it's, you've got quite strong opinions, let's put it like that. I've got quite strong opinions. And I think it's really good that people who differ on a lot of things have the courage and commitment to talk to each other.
Yeah.
Because, without getting into the discussion, there's a lot of, I don't agree with that person, so I'm not going to talk to them, sort of culture emerging, isn't there?
Yeah.
And I think we both agree that it's good to talk about disagreements.
Yeah.
And I think this is fundamental commonality we've got, that if we're going to make it through this enormous crisis, you're going to have to talk to people you don't like.
Yeah. And actually that's one of the things we're going to be talking about partway through, I think. I totally agree. We're going to hopefully try and model how you can be...
Not that I don't like you, by the way.
No, I like you too, but we're going to try and model maybe how to be civil when there's important things to disagree about. So what are we going to be talking about? So we're going to start off, we'll see where the conversation goes, but we're going to start off talking about the strategy of the climate movement with respect to the question of, should we be being more radical, should we be being more moderate? So I'll make a few remarks about that to kick us off. Extinction Rebellion was founded as a radical flank to the existing environmental movement to pull the whole debate more in the kind of direction it needed to be pulled in. And I think it's pretty safe to say that it's a point of agreement between myself and Roger, and hopefully you watching as well, that in that ambition at least, Extinction Rebellion, especially in the UK, has really succeeded pretty damn well. That in the period from the autumn of 2018 through to April, May 2019, Extinction Rebellion's strategy succeeded in ripping open the debate and kicking open the Overton window and moving the whole thing. Extinction Rebellion did not achieve the letter of its demands, but power conceded something to each of its demands on the back of that massive movement of consciousness and of the conversation. We had the symbolic declaration of climate and environment emergency in Parliament. We had the first net zero law, albeit 25 years too late. And we had the parliamentary declaration of a climate citizens assembly, all achieved within months of that April rebellion. Pretty damn impressive, I think. We're both pretty proud of our parts in that, and perhaps you had a part in that as well. So where do we go from here? There have been various efforts to create a more radical flank to Extinction Rebellion. Roger's been intimately involved with most of those. So there was Heathrow Pause, there was Burning Pink, recently, of course, Insulate Britain. There's a new one brewing, which I think we're going to be talking about, which is quite exciting. My question has been, for the last year or so, whether that's the right direction to move in, or whether what we oughtn't to be doing is trying to exploit the space that Extinction Rebellion successfully opened up. And that's why I've started talking about the need for what I'm calling a moderate flank in climate activism. The need to fill the space that's been opened up with a whole set of new organisations, initiatives, movements, which are going to try to make happen on the ground, to a large extent, the changes that have failed to be brought in by government. So a few examples of what the moderate flank is that is already, I think, coming into existence. You've got Lawyers for Net Zero, which is trying to gather together lawyers to push for climate action through their discipline, through their law firms. You've got Wildcard, which is seeking to get the royal lands rewilded. Mothership, which is seeking to get mothers involved in innovative ways in climate and eco-action. and you've got the climate and the climate emergency centres movement, which I think is a very exciting development, seeking to create one-stop shops for climate and eco-action around the country. And the intriguing thing is that all of those were founded by people who've been quite big in XR. So people who, in some sense or another, like me, think actually maybe the most important thing right now, or at least maybe one of the most important things right now, is to try to co-create this new mass distributed moderate flank to fill the space that XR successfully opens up. So I think, that's sort of a natural place to start, thinking about Roger as someone who's been advocating further radical flanks, and myself as someone who's been moving, if you will, slightly in the opposite direction of thinking, how might we actually create successful moderate flanks? Because, and this is the kicker, my firm belief is that it looks like we are not, at least for the next few years, in a period where we are going to get the numbers that we need getting involved in radical flank type outfits. Whereas it seems to me we could quite easily get millions, including defectors from the establishment, signing up to moderate flank organisations. So Roger, what do you make of that?
Rubbish! Oh dear. Right, so, it's always good to have a bit of gallows humour, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, well, as I said to you before we had the discussion, because we talked about it a little bit, didn't we? I have a problem with the usefulness of constructing strategy around the notion of a middle ground, a moderate flank, and a radical flank. Now, I'm not saying that's not useful in some contexts, but one of the things I've been trying to communicate for the last 2 or 3 years is what we're facing with the climate crisis is fundamentally, metaphysically, if you like, completely different than everyday political conflict.
Yep.
And this isn't a rhetorical point. It's not like I'm trying to get at people on the go. I'm saying objectively, in the sense that if we're honest enough to follow the science, which is what we're all supposed to be doing, there's 2 fundamental points, which is we're facing a cliff edge. And it's very difficult to acknowledge that. I mean, people go, yes, the Arctic's going to melt in the summer, the Amazon's going to collapse. But we don't, it's very difficult to take on the full existential meaning of that, because for the last 10,000 years, without beating around the bush, people have gone, there's a crisis, we're going to we've got to deal with the crisis, and then everything's going to go back to normal.
Yes.
And for the first time in 10,000 years, the whole damn thing is never going to go back to normal, objectively, i.e. the basis of human habitability. And we know that leads on to 2 other points, which is, number one, it's not going to come back to normal ever, effectively, i.e. for the next 100,000 years. Some people say a bit less, some people say 4 million. I mean, who gives a damn?
Yeah.
And secondly, we've got human extinction in the frame. Now, that's very difficult to emotionally comprehend. But I think if we're going to be smart and clever and honest with ourselves, we have to acknowledge that human extinction, it's not guaranteed, but it's certainly in the ballpark, fundamentally changes our strategy and our ethics around what needs to happen. So what does that mean? It means, for me, what that means is there's no flanks, right? What that means for me is it's an emergency. And again, that's not a rhetorical political point. It's an objective emergency. In other words, like what we have in the climate movement is this constant toing and froing between the political and the objective, as you might say. So how I define the political is, you've got your interests, I've got mine, and we have an argument about it, and we build alliances against each other, and someone wins, and you get your interests or I get mine, right? And that's a legitimate, for the sake of argument, that's a legitimate form of social activity because obviously people have different interests. But objectively, with the climate, and I said this 4 years ago in the initial paper that led to the setting up of XR, my fundamental sort of first line point is an existential crisis is not, in that definition, a political crisis, in so much as objectively it's in everyone's interest for it not to happen. That's different than, I've got my political beliefs. So I'm not trying to denigrate the political. I'm just saying it doesn't fit if we're honest with ourselves. And the problem is people like to go back into the comfort zone of the political because we know what that looks like. It's like Rupert and Read Roger, and we have coalitions and, political, all the stuff that we sort of know. So my core point here, I suppose, is there's only one position, which makes me sound like ultra dogmatic. But in my defense, what I'm trying to say is there are times, I'm just about to do a Facebook post about this, there are circumstances where everyone agrees there's only one position. There's only one position on rape. It's not like we're negotiating about it. There's only one position on child abuse. It's not political. It's obscene. It's an outrage. It's a moral catastrophe.
Yeah.
There was only one position on Hitler, dare I say it. No one's saying, well, some people do, obviously, but everyone with human values is saying there was no debate. This guy had to go. And a sort of little aside on this is one of the things I think is interesting and, about World War II is you had this alliance of people right across the board from different cultures, and we can talk about more about this, who had so much antagonism towards each other, culturally, politically, historically. But they all came together because if they knew if they didn't defeat Hitler, then all their values would be done in. That was the end. It was the end of civilization. And it was true. It wasn't a, So, the classic thing is conservative Catholics working with Republican socialists in the French resistance. So the point those two groups were making is there was only one response to Hitler, which was resistance. There wasn't a moderate flank. You see what I mean? And that's what I'm trying to say. When you've got an emergency, when you've got 3 years left, according to Sir David King, when you're looking at 100,000 years of whatever hell, there's only one strategic position and there's only one moral position, which is resistance. And I'll concretize that, right? Because what's that? Well, what that means is unless there's a good excuse, as it were, and obviously there are, not everyone can go into classical, people have got responsibilities, but the vast majority of people are capable of saying to the government, you've crossed a line, you are now in an act of war against the next generation, the next 10,000 generations. You're in an act of war against the poor of the global south. You're in an act of war against the natural world. COP has utterly failed.
Completely
and
agree.
You have crossed a line which is non-negotiable. This is my fundamental point. This is my fundamental criticism of the NGOs, is there has to be a line where you go into resistance, objectively. And if we haven't crossed it with COP26, God knows when we are going to cross it. So, my proposition to everyone is yes, you have to make a demand, like everyone has done in these situations during history. You make a demand, like Gandhi used to do, and Martin Luther King, and then you say, we will now go and disrupt society, whether it's motorways, oil depots, hunger strikes, whatever it is, not paying your taxes. There's an array, as we know, of different things, but you're obligated to do that morally. And also, I'll shut up in a minute, also, strategically, my whole core argument during the early days of XR is by speaking this truth, you maximize the mobilization of people who will then move to what you call the radical flank, but I would call the objective moral position. So it's not like if you present a moderate flank proposition, then you're sort of letting people off the hook. You see what I mean?
I do see what you mean, but let me try to respond. So let's take your Second World War analogy. Obviously, in many ways, it's a great analogy. What we need is that same spirit of emergency mobilization. It's a great example of people actually going beyond politics, beyond party politics, beyond ideology in the way you alluded to. So the classic example I like to cite is in the Second World War, people of all different political hues agreed on the need for food rationing as part of the response. They didn't agree to it because it was a socialist idea or because it led to a more equal society, which it did. They agreed to it because it was necessary for common survival. But now here's the thing. Although objectively, I agree with your analysis, we are in that situation, and objectively resistance is completely justified. That's why we were completely together through the first couple of years of Extinction Rebellion. The tragedy is that on the one hand, we've succeeded in moving climate consciousness a great deal. But on the other hand, that is still quite a kind of thin achievement, which has not come to dominate everyday politics. And we have not moved into emergency mode. And most people would not really deeply yet fully accept the analogy. One reason why they wouldn't, by the way, and this is very important, is that, of course, there is an objective difference between the situations. The Second World War was a classic example where you could hope that what would happen would be that people would succeed in coming together, defeat the enemy, and then basically more or less go back to normal. And in that way, it's very different. As you said, Roger, we are in a long, essentially a permanent emergency. But that's a weird kind of emergency. It's very hard for it to feel like an emergency because of the way it moves so inexorably slowly on timescales and at geographical scales, which are so hard for human beings to comprehend. Now, what's the point of all this? Well, the point of all this is that what you did in the last 10 minutes or so is you kind of made my position look like a bit of a sort of copping out or like not really stepping up to the plate and so on. But what I'm trying to say is, look, the objective reality is that most people are not up to the plate yet in their thinking for all the success that we have had. Until we get a lot more people moving a lot further in their thinking and in their actions, until we have a lot more people, for example, really comprehending how profoundly vulnerable they, let alone their children, now are, it's not going to make sense to a lot of those people to do the kinds of desperate things that we feel driven to do. In particular, for example, I think that it's fair to say that the evidence shows that most people in this country did not understand why Insulate Britain were doing what they were doing, why it was justified to block motorways, etc. So, my argument is, because of that crucial difference, there is a case in relation to this emergency, this permanent, new, tragic, endlessly changing condition that we're in. There's going to be no going back to normal. There is an argument for, and there is a position for, and there is a place for what I'm calling the moderate flank approach in the way that there wasn't before. One other thing which is really, really important to understand about this is that these terms moderate and radical, you know, I accept that they're kind of quite crude and they're just placeholders, really. There's a sense in which the moderate flank is, or at least can be, more realistic and in a certain sense even more radical than the radical flank. What do I mean? Well, all the things that I've just said are part of the backdrop for the moderate flank approach, and what that involves is accepting that we are not going to get the kind of overnight transformation that we really need to be getting and ought to be getting. I mean, let's think again about XR's demands, for example. Second demand, go carbon neutral and stop ecosystem destruction by 2025. Well, you know, it's now 2022, right? And it's clear every passing day that that demand is simply, you know, no longer credible in a time kind of analysis. Now, your approach, Roger, I totally accept the sort of objective analysis and the place of desperation and fury that it's coming from, which I think is reasonable. But there is a danger that your approach allows people to carry on thinking, you know what, if we up the ante enough, if we block enough motorways, etc., then we'll win, the government will fall, we'll take over, there'll be a revolutionary transformation, we'll achieve our demands really quickly, and then we can go back to normal. I mean, I think that is what some people kind of think. They kind of think that if the radical flank really succeeded, then we would be able to absolutely fix this. Whereas the moderate flank approach is a bit more kind of saying, you know what, people are not quite there yet. The nature of this emergency is different. Government is simply not stepping up to the plate. We're going to have to do what we can through our workplaces, through our local communities, etc., to start to make changes directly on the ground that are objectively needed and that government is failing to do, which is another way that you might argue that the moderate flank is as radical as or more radical than the radical flank, actually directly doing the changes that need to be happen rather than asking someone else to do them. But also what I was getting at was, the crucial thing about this is that this part of the moderate flank analysis kind of accepts that it's 5 past midnight, that we're not going to get everything sorted, that we're going to fail to reach the demands that Exiles put down, that 1.5 degrees is gone, that the situation is going to be one of managing a disastrous, potentially catastrophic situation endlessly, that there isn't going to be any kind of fixing of it. And there's a kind of, I think there's a kind of maturity to that and a kind of invitation to psychological reflection. Whereas there is, as I say, this slight danger that if you just remain endlessly in the radical flank kind of mindset, then you never get to have that kind of pause. And you never get to look inward in this way, this really kind of painful way of kind of accepting, my God, you know, our demands are objectively justified, the situation is as it is, resistance is completely justified, and yet it's not happening. We don't have the numbers. We're not going to succeed in making these changes and completely winning.
Yeah, okay, so I think, with all due respect, you might be mixing up the sociological with the normative. What I mean by that, I'm sure you know what I mean, but to expand it, it's like, I will happily concede to you that in any process of political, social transformation, there's always some people that really want something, some people that want it a bit, and a long tail, as it were, of people who are maybe, right? That's a iron law of human activity, right? You know, it's a normal distribution curve for the sake of argument. So there's a certain sociological determinism about that. Like, any time there's change, by definition, there's some people that are really full on about it and a long tail of people that are, you know, maybe type people. But that analysis has no necessary impact upon a normative and a strategic analysis, right? So the normative analysis is asking the question, this is the situation, that's the sociological one. The normative question is, what should I do? Mm-hmm. What should you, as Rupert, do over the next year with your time? Mm-hmm. What do people watching this need to do? Yeah. That's a really concrete moral point. And then there's the strategic thing is, you know, what's actually going to have most effect, right? So I think there's a little bit of what you're saying is it's this sort of, there's a slight sort of, because that's the way of the world, we have to fit into the way of the world, if you see what I mean. So one point I want to sort of...
I mean, it's more partly that I'm trying to kind of accept the reality where we're at, for example, in terms of the numbers, right? So if we look at the Chenoweth kind of numbers, 3.5%. So XR is saying we're going to get millions on the street in April 2022. You know, I hope XR succeed in that objective. I'll be completely astounded if they do. Whereas I think it is possible that we could get millions involved in what I'm calling the moderate
All
flank.
right,
And
well,
the
yeah.
reason it's possible is because of the success that XR had in 2019. So that's why I started out by saying, what do we learn from what happened in 2019? Do we learn the lesson, let's do more of the same? Do we learn the lesson, let's up the ante and go more radical? Or do we learn the lesson, now a lot of people have had their minds open and are ready for something. What is that something? Maybe it's the kind of stuff that I and Lawyers for Net Zero and the climate emergency centres and so on are talking about.
Yeah. So I'm going to come on to that. But I just want to finish this point about starting with the way the world is and saying because the world is like X, we have to fit in with X. So I'm just reading a book at the moment about doomster type people in the States, and they're basically saying we looked at the science, the human race is going to get destroyed. There's no question about it. There's no point in doing anything, and therefore, normatively, we shouldn't do anything. Well, that therefore is not rational. It's like just because the world is like that doesn't mean we have to accept it. And the reason I'm emphasising this is the heart of the activist proposition, which is we have agency to create change. We're not subject to these laws. And the other point, of course, the sociological point is the more that you accept the world as it is, the more the world will be as it is. In other words, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's one of the most vile things about cowardly fatalism is it's not just, fair enough, you don't want to do anything. What you're basically saying is to other people, don't do anything as well. And so you're actually creating it, right? In so much as it's not objectively done, right? It's a hypothesis. We don't know whether we're going extinct, but it's definitely on the cards. So then let's move on to how political change actually works and how it's probably going to work in a crisis, in an existential emergency. So where I disagree with you here is partially from the studies I've done, but partially from what I pick up, and this is a bit of a theoretical point, I suppose, but is when a society is fundamentally on the wrong track, economically, socially, spiritually, it's basically heading for a fall.
Yeah.
And I don't want you to misunderstand me here by, I'm a revolutionary because of the context, right? I'm not a revolutionary because revolution's always right. Like in the 1990s, forget it. There's not a chance in a million years of a revolution, right? Reformism is where it's at, go and join Greenpeace. In 2022, my proposition is we're in a revolutionary period. It's deterministic in the sense that we've got this big juggernaut out there. This is one of the things a lot of activists are in denial about. One of the reasons we've been so unsuccessful is not because we've been rubbish, it's because what we're facing is so completely systemic. Again, economically, politically, socially, culturally, spiritually. It's like, you can look at elements there where you've got this hegemonic force which is taking us over the cliff. You've got capitalism, you've got the culture of growth, you've got individualism, you've got, the alienation from any form of collective action. All these things come together. So what I'm saying sociologically is that it's not going to happen gradually, right? In this particular context, what's going to happen is there's going to be a massive explosion through this intense social repression that now a large proportion of the population realises, either consciously or subconsciously. They sort of know. And one sign of that, an empirical sign of that, is I'm disputing that there aren't people out there who are engaged in civil resistance.
Of course there are. The question is how many. The question is one of orders of magnitude, right? That's the question I'm asking. Of course, I completely agree with you that we're heading off a cliff. In fact, the way I like to put it now is we're already off the cliff. Most people don't realise that yet. We've got to try to stop our tumbling down. We've got to try to clamber back up. And I completely agree with you that, as I like to put it, this civilization is finished. The only question is, how does it end? Does it end by continuing the crash, which is most likely, or do we manage to find some way of pulling it back up again, which is going to involve, as you say, a complete systems level transformation. It's going to involve a paradigm shift. And that paradigm shift is coming. You know, the paradigm shift will either come deliberately through concerted action and multi-level change, or it'll come accidentally through collapse, which is what we're on course for. But yeah, the issue is, well, one very simple way of putting the issue is, do we have the numbers yet for the mode of that transformation which you're envisaging? Another way, slightly more subtle, of putting the question is, if we again go back to Chenoweth, one of the things that she's quite clear about, but which people haven't necessarily always picked up on as much, is that even once you have 3.5%, which is millions of people in a country like the UK, you also need a far larger plurality behind that, who are broadly supportive. If you have 3.5% for you and 96.5% against, you're completely fucked. You know, there's no way you win in that situation. Right. So part of what I'm talking about is, how do we actually get to millions? And I'm suggesting that my strategy may be more likely to achieve that. And another part of it is, how do we get the sort of, it's not exactly a long tail, it's the kind of supportive underbelly. I sometimes use the metaphor of an iceberg. You know, you've got really radical resistors on the top, you've got maybe a huge moderate flank below that, as it were. And then below the waterline, you still need a lot more people broadly on side, otherwise you're still going to lose.
Right. So, well, let's take those one step at a time, right? So number one, like, your proposition is there's not enough people, arguably, right, to engage in civil resistance. That's like an empirical question. Mm-hmm. You know, are there or aren't there, you know? Let's go and have a look out the window.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got strong empirical evidence there are, right? In the sense that if I go and, you know, I do 4 or 5 meetings a week, right, public meetings. So I've got my finger on the pulse of the XR movement and the public more generally. You know, I mean, I'm not saying it's conclusive data, obviously, but if we do a talk, 2 or 3 people will agree to do civil disobedience, either to be arrested several times or even potentially go to prison. Mm-hmm. So you can do the maths, right? Mm-hmm. We know from the top judiciary and government insiders that there is a point, let's concretise it, there is a point of creating legislative change, right? Mm-hmm. And that happens all the time. It happened in the BLM protests, you know, with Minnesota saying they were going to respond to police reform. We saw it in France when they withdrew the diesel price increase, you know, in 2018, was it? Mm. And interestingly enough, it's not really on many people's radar, but thousands of people went to the motorways, dare I say it, in Serbia, like about 5 weeks ago, on 2 Saturdays, and they reversed a whole series of legislation by the Serbian government to allow multinationals to rip up the country for mining rights, right? So we know this is how political change works, right? So my proposition to you, and, you know, I'm involved in Just Stop Oil, and my observations, as I said to you the other day, is there could be, let's say, there could be 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people engaged in civil disobedience this spring, which puts us in the ballpark of forcing the government to engage in legislative change, right? That's the first thing, right? Mm-hmm. The second thing is how, you know, you raise a legitimate point, which is, how do you actually bring the 70% of the population along with you? Yeah. So what we also know is, when you have a moral issue which is objective, as it were, like slavery or, you know, race rights or Hitler or these things, is once a small proportion of a society enters into resistance, you get a rapid flipping effect, assuming it remains non-violent. As a general rule, you know, this isn't determinism, but as a general rule, you will find a whole load of people very quickly changing as a result of your radical flank scenario, which I'm not calling it radical flank, right? I'm calling it, you know, your moral responsibility. Mm-hmm. In order, for instance, like in 1961, Martin Luther King was the most unpopular man in America. Their strategy wasn't to go to white liberals and say, let's set up some more nice liberal organisations. What their strategy was full on, full pelt, mass civil disobedience, focusing on creating high-level political conflict, involving people dying, involving violence. That was the strategy, in order to expose that obscene racism. And during those 5 years, that radical flank, inverted commas, strategy created a new zeitgeist, a new normal in American society, that racism was unacceptable.
Yeah.
As what you might call the national consensus, right? Everyone knows that didn't solve the whole thing, but let's not be black and white about it. Substantive change in American culture, right? So what I see happening with the climate is what happened in the 60s on steroids. Because what we're facing with the climate is not the obscenity of the treatment of 11 million black Americans. We're dealing with the obscenity of the willful murder and destruction of billions of people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I'm trying to be contextual, you see what I mean? I'm not trying to say this is always how it happens. I totally take your point that often, in normal politics you build an alliance, but in this situation, you have to pursue this. This is the strategy that these people watching need to pursue. Because the other point is there's this self-fulfilling thing that you're on this video and you say, well, guys, we need to do a moderate flank. Then that encourages people to not get to that critical mass. And that's where it becomes quite unpleasant, because it's a bit like, there's a moral issue there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way I would put that is less like that. I would say, I hope, as we said at the start, that we're in a spirit of potential conviviality here. And I think what is certainly clear is that we need, if you will, a kind of balanced movement ecosystem that enables people to find spaces in it that they are comfortable with and to move from one to another. So you've mentioned like people in the judiciary and so on. I think it'd be fantastic if some of them came out and did civil disobedience next week, but I don't think that's very likely. But I think there are things that they could do that'd be really helpful, that we can encourage them to do, which are somewhere on a kind of a spectrum. I mean, in terms of the numbers question, so in terms of Just Stop Oil, I'm really encouraged by what I've heard so far about Just Stop Oil. It sounds to me as though some of the lessons of some of the things which haven't gone so well in the last few years in XR and in Insulate Britain and so on may have been learnt. I think it will make more sense to people to focus on what is in a certain sense the real cause of the trouble, i.e. fossil fuels. I think if you've got the kind of numbers that you're talking about, you may be able to do mass non-violent direct action against that industry in a way which will make sense to people and which will be successful and which will be dramatic and which will encourage real change. I hope all that happens. If it happens in that kind of way, I'll be there to support it totally. But I would make a couple of points beyond that. One is you're saying you're going to have thousands of people. That's brilliant. But that isn't millions of people, let alone tens of millions of people in broad support. And then you say, well, yeah, but we're going to get this kind of flipping effect. But then we come to the point that this issue, I mean, it's not even an issue what we're talking about. It's a total, as we've said, it's a total crisis of civilization. The analogies with past struggles are problematic, and that's one of the things I try to argue in this little advert here. Extinction, Rebellion, Insights from the Inside. Yeah,
I haven't got one.
Which responds, among other things, to your Common Sense for the 21st Century pamphlet. One of the arguments I make in that book is a crucial difference between our situation and the situation of the civil rights movement in the 60s. You say, our situation is a lot worse, it's a much more objective, bigger crisis. I completely agree. But most people still don't really at a deep level understand that. And I think we have to do things to bring them to understand that, rather than hoping that they can arrive instantly sort of at the end of the journey. And B, there is a massive difference between how easy it is for power to concede our demands. Right. So at the end of the day, there were intelligent people in the US federal government who understood, look, actually, we can bring black people into this system and bring them into our democracy and bring them more fully into the economic system. And it doesn't really fundamentally change the things that we want, the things that we need, the things that we take for granted. The corporations, the elites, the big money, they all know that the things that we want to do are in some sense, in the short to medium term, going to be bad for them. And a lot of ordinary people are aware that even if that might not be true, then it is true that, you know, a lot of things are going to have to change. It's not just that renewable energy is going to is going to replace, you know, joule for joule the energy that we get from fossil fuels. No, you know, the future, if there's going to be a future, is going to be a future where there is less air travel. It's going to be a future where there is much more local food growing and many more people on the land, etc., etc. This civilization is finished. The transformation is going to have to be profound, wide, and deep. So it's far more difficult to get what we want and what we need than it was for Martin Luther King et al. And for that reason, I think we have to be honest enough and strategic enough to try to find ways of bringing broad masses of people on this journey. This is not the kind of transformation that can be imposed from top down. This is my reason for differing with so-called eco-Leninists like Andreas Malm, who, you know, is sort of one step further on the radical spectrum, if you will, than your good self. I think that it is completely implausible to think that we could succeed in taking the reins of power and imposing the kind of change that is necessary on the populace at large. We have to bring most people with us, otherwise this will not happen. It's a civilization level transformation. Yeah. And that's why I think strategies that are thinking, okay, yeah, how do we get the envelope being pushed by radical action, and how do we have a big broad swathe that comes along actively, seriously behind that, and how do we keep on board the broad mass of the population? You can have some people against you, but if you end up having 60, 70, 80% of people against you, you're fucked.
Yeah, well, we both agree about that, right? So what potentially we disagree about is what's the method of change. And what I'm saying is, and I'm 100% certain on this, dare I say it, which is it's not going to be pretty, right? It's not going to be rational in the sense of let's sit down and give people more information.
No, sure.
Right? There's been what you might call the moderate flank approach for, you know, the last 30 years.
Let me just be clear, quick clarification. I'm calling for, and I see starting to emerge, a new, potentially mass distributed moderate flank. These organisations I named before, right? These are new. I'm not saying, you know, let's just go with the traditional NGOs. I'm talking about people who are trying to do stuff. You know, I'm talking about people like the Lawyers for Net Zero type thing, for example. They want to eventually get to a point where lawyers are doing things like saying, you shouldn't do that because you run the risk of being sued in future. We're not going to take this client because they've got these.
Right, yeah.
And at every level they're pressing. You know, one of the reasons why the law is a good institution to press through is it's one of those sort of points in society which everything sort of has to pass through, you know. And if you start to get lawyers and then, you know, as we were saying earlier, the judiciary asking awkward questions and not going along with power and so on, well, then you're really getting somewhere.
Yeah.
So I'm not at all saying, oh, you know, let's go back to the old kind of 1990s approach. I'm saying let's exploit the success of XR to move as far as we can without frightening all the horses behind the changing consciousness that has been created so far.
Well, what I think we need to do is concretize these generalities a little bit. Like, you know, we're going to talk to lawyers. What is, you know, we're going to get lawyers on our side. What does this concretely mean? So what I'm saying is there's two failed paradigms of change, right? One is information provision.
Yeah.
I'm going to the lawyers, I'm going to tell them that 1.5 is done, blah, 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 right? And the other one is persuasion and argument. Like, I'm going to go to the lawyers and I'm going to make an argument, right? Now, both of those have functionality when you're not dealing with major personal change. You know, I can say, you know, do you want to go and do the washing up? I'll give you information. There's lots of washing up to be done, and I'll suggest that it's your turn, right? And you'll go and do it because it's not a big deal. But if you're a Southern racist in 1961, I can argue with you until the cows come home, literally, and you're not going to change because it's a fundamental part of your identity that you have a right under God, under state rights, to dominate and exploit black people. You're not going to change, right? And what the black rights movement did, as you know, for 90 years, they had this approach, and they got absolutely nowhere. And in 1958, there was this explosion of civil disobedience, and suddenly there was a glimmer, like we've seen with XR. There's this glimmer of actually this is how it works. We're not saying it definitely will work, but what we are saying is information and rational argument is definitely not going to work, right?
Yeah.
As much as, there is a sociological law about it. When you're dealing with entrenched power, and what we're absolutely dealing with here is entrenched power, not in some reductive Marxist, we're the oppressors and we're pushing you down. Obviously, there's an element of that, but it's deeper than that. It's cultural and spiritual, and it's a way of being, isn't it? Like the Southern way of life. It's like we are provided with this supremacism because of religious, fundamental core reasons. So this society out there has this fundamental arrogance that we can destroy nature because nature means nothing. And we have this right to continually produce. And, everyone sort of knows now that it's done. But they still, you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
So the transformation, the only thing on the cards, and I'm not saying it's 100% will work, but we're talking pragmatically here, right?
Yeah.
We've got two strategies. So we've got to compare them. But for the sake of argument, there's a 50-60% chance that when you engage in civil resistance, you throw the dice on saying to the population, we can't carry on like this. And that population changes really rapidly. And there's two sort of theories of change here. So let's just identify. One theory of change is you have an advertising campaign, you change people's attitudes, it's informational, right? And then another theory of change is what you might call Freudian-esque. I don't want to get into Freud, in terms of what he was particularly saying. But what I'm trying to say is you disagree with me. So empirically, it looks like you disagree with me, but deeper down, you actually know I'm right, right? And we know in our personal relationships and family relationships, when someone's doing something wrong, often they're really aggressive before they decide that actually you were right.
Yeah.
And so there's a fundamental difference of analysis. So when people talk about Insulate Britain, they go, well, you're upsetting people. So their paradigm is, if you upset people, they're less, you're pushing them away. But there's another analysis, which means you're upsetting people because they're out to flip and agree with you. Now, those are two very different interpretations of the same empirical data.
Sure.
And I'm not saying that one is absolutely right and one's absolutely wrong. But my argument is, in this particular context, unless people go through this period of emotional turmoil, they're not actually going to change in the same way as you've got to shout at a teenager to do the washing up. You see, because the rational argument isn't going to work. Now, just to complete this point is, as I think we both agree on this is why it's absolutely essential that the civil resistance is non-violent.
Yeah.
But more than just non-violent, it has to be dialogical. In other words, it's not like, it can't be just pragmatic, we're not going to be violent because, it works. It has to be deeper than that. There has to be a spiritual-esque realization that humanity has fundamental commonalities. Every human being has a fundamental commonality. And when you go and talk to your opponent, they're fundamentally human. And I don't mean this in some hippie way. I mean in the sense that it's actually biologically, socially, and culturally the case. Because we all know, and the literature is full of this, is you can sit down with someone and within 5 minutes, you made some connection, right? Because there's more to life than political conflict, right?
Yeah.
So I think that having that thing that XR brought into the climate movement is essential, and this is one of the best things about XR. And I've got plenty of criticisms of XR, but one of the fantastic things about XR was, in its very imperfect way, it was actually trying to transform the way we do human relations, both inside the movement, but potentially how we actually treat the opposition.
Yeah, it was in the sense,
and the general population.
Yeah,
and it's that there's that two-sided thing, which is, yes, we're disrupting you and you're getting emotional, and we're also being respectful in our communication to provide you with this face-saving way in which you can make that division. And that's, of course, the stupidity of the violent approach, which is, you win the war, but you lose the peace.
Nice.
And, see that in Iraq, for instance.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. In that sense, XR was beautiful. It was prefigurative, and it was modelling this kind of civil model of how you do disagreement. I want to see more of that in future. I don't think people felt that quite as much with Insulate Britain, and I'm very sceptical that Insulate Britain has helped people reach this point of kind of flipping. I think, as I said, that Just Stop Oil may stand a much better chance of doing that. But can I say a little bit more about my theory of change in the current context, for example, because it's not as you characterized it. So what I think, and I suspect we agree on this, is that a key part of my theory of change in terms of where we are now is that we've got to keep absolutely radically telling the truth. And we've got to keep being authentic about that, which includes being emotional about it. And that's one of the key ways in which it's not the old kind of information model, right? It's about being willing to do the kinds of things that, both you and I and others of our colleagues have done on cameras, our voices breaking, turning directly to the lens, addressing the interviewer directly and saying that aren't you personally worried about this? Don't you, do you have children yourself? All these kinds of things. And if we do that kind of stuff, that can help us break through to some extent. Going further than that, what I passionately believe, and what is again described in this little beauty, is that we've got to get people deeper into the sense of their vulnerability and their children's vulnerability, that they're not far enough into that yet, most people, to really, most people have now got to the stage that they're willing to answer a question in an opinion poll, is climate one of the most important issues facing us today, with the answer yes, and that's real progress, and that's a lot the result of XR. But most people have not really got to the point where they're willing to say, maybe a lot of them feel it, but they're willing to say, I really fear for my child's life and future, and I understand that climate disasters may well be coming to take them during the next 10, 20, 30 years, or that there may be massive food scarcity, that we could get multi-breadbasket failures. Most people have not got to that stage yet, and I think we need to take them on a journey to that, which involves multiple dimensions. I think it involves continued work, such as the work that Just Stop Oil are going to try to do. And I think it involves work on a whole load of other dimensions. So in terms of what I'm hoping is going to happen through the moderate flank, and what I'm seeing start to happen, it's taking that spirit and applying it in all the key locales of our society. And the two which I identify as most important are our workplaces and our real local geographical communities. So in our workplaces, to take an example, the kind of thing I'm saying is what we need people to do is not just go around saying this stuff, but saying it and experiencing it in an emotional way, projecting it into scenarios for what could happen, and then drawing the consequences of that in terms of what ought to happen in their workplace. And what does that mean? So it means everything from, what the hell are we doing still commuting to work, to what are we doing with our profits? Are we actually making the world a better place with them? To what's our supply chain? Is it carbon heavy? Does it have long miles? Is it resilient? Are we thinking about how it's going to stand up in the years ahead? And then taking action to change every one of those things in whichever way you can do that, whether that be through a trades union or through a professional association or through talking to your employer or through just starting to make changes or through threatening to withdraw your labour if those kinds of changes are not met. And if that kind of thing were to start happening, taking action in those kind of ways in every single workplace, especially the ones that really have the strongest leverage, places like the law and audit and insurance and so forth. If that were to start happening across the shop, that I believe would be transformative, and that I can see involving millions of people. So that's my vision of change.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely necessary and, economically inevitable, right? In so much as it's coming anyway, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's a great vision. Where I think we disagree is it's going to be non-linear. It's not, and there's a number of, flesh this out a little bit more. There's a number of reasons for this. The most obvious reason is it's not superficial. We've left the period of history where this can trundle along in a fairly, small way. We have to reduce carbon emissions. It's going to be a complete transformation. Everyone knows that. I mean, in Insulate Britain, it was funny because, to be honest, I don't know much about insulation. I'm a mobilisation guy, right? So, I thought, insulate. You always have this idea, don't you? Oh, we're going to do this change, and then you actually talk to the guy on the ground, who, the engineer, the frontline guy, the transport manager, and he tells you it's completely off the scale what has to happen. And I remember, talking to this guy, and he said, if you want to insulate, you've got to, I forgot what he said now. He said,
you've got to train loads of people.
You've got to train loads of people. You've got to change the culture of the builders because they're pissed off because they haven't got much money. You've got to train people. Where's the trainers going to come from? Where's the money going to come from 29 million homes? Where's the raw materials going to come from? Because there's loads of international competition. Basically we need £600 billion to do this. The government's committed 1.5. This is World War II on steroids, right? It's fun. It's massive. And again, this isn't a rhetorical. This is physics, right? There's houses. You've got to insulate them. They cost time. You can't create labour out of nothing. There's only so many people in the country. That's an objective fact. If 3 million of them are doing houses, that means 2.5 million people are going to have to stop doing what else they're going to do. There's not some magic tree here. So that I can't see any other way that there has to be this big, I know it's an unpopular word, but revolutionary change, right? In how, and it's got to be thrust through by this civil resistance methodology, which is the right fit for this extremity, right? And the other thing is a lot of, just want to take you up a little bit on this, but, you wrote the book, what's it called? This Civilization is Finished, right? And we both, I think what most people think by that is we've got to change the economy, we've got to change, the politics. But for me, what it means more fundamentally is we have to change the way we see the individual, the way we have to. We've been brought up in this cult of neoliberal possessive individualism, which all the social science contradicts. People are not happier when they get more money. People are not happy when they make individual decisions. People aren't happy when they look after number one. People are happier when they're in loving relationships, in stable communities, with a culture that's coherent. And
doing meaningful stuff.
We all know this, right? This is not green propaganda. It's solid social science, right? And so if we try and produce a theory of change, which is based upon individuals in small groups, that's not how it's going to work. To my mind, what we've got to see is society as an entity in itself. It's not it's like the individual is an abstraction as much as society for me. It's like, what's the individual? Okay, you're physically there, but what does that mean? The fact of the matter is you're enormously influenced all the time by people around you emotionally. Do they like you? Don't they like you? Am I doing something meaningful? You know, do I fit in? Drum bum bum.
And also the air going in and out of my lungs.
Exactly.
Right?
That's, you know, we've got all these bugs in our stomach. I mean, it's a nonsense. It's a construction, right? Which isn't to say it's totally dysfunctional. Yes, you know, it's got its usefulness, but it's totally overplayed in the way we construct our reality.
Yeah.
And what we have to revert to, as it were, and rediscover, which is, you know, the traditional way of looking upon social reality, you know, indigenous peoples, traditional societies, but also, you know, before 1989, dare I say it, most people had the idea that there is a society, and the society actually has a real entity, and that society basically recreates itself through herding dynamics, want of a better word. In other words, at some point, everyone is going to decide there has to be fundamental change. Not everyone, 80%, let's say. And there'll be this big change, and then all the workplaces will be changing within 6 months. And this is the World War II analogy, of course. It's slightly, you know, it's one iteration of it. But I'll just finish by just giving this, you know, this interesting historical point of whenever it was, 1939, right? The British public was utterly opposed to war for very understandable reasons, because they just had World War I, right? They weren't being cowardly. They, you know, who wants to go to war again? And they were in this, you know, wishful thinking, in retrospect, we can say this wishful thinking phase that Hitler was going to be, he's just a nationalist, he's a bit of a clown, you know, blah, blah, blah. A bit like what people think about Trump, right? It's like, you know, he's all right, you know, his passing phase. No, right? This guy is a psychopath, right? And you have these crises where, you know, he unites with Austria, well, fair enough, you know, it's German, and then he takes part of Czechoslovakia, well, that's a German part. And he's just trying to reunite the German people. And then suddenly he invades the Czech Republic. And within the space of 2 weeks, the whole psyche of British society flips from wishful appeasement to, okay, we're going to have to go to war. We can't, you know, a line has been crossed in the sand, as it were. And everyone knew then, you know, what this guy was dealing with.
Is there going to be that equivalent of a line, Roger? You see, that's what I'm sceptical of. Again, I hope you're right, but what I see as much more likely is that I agree with you totally as well that society is as much and as little a construct as the individual. But what I see when I look at our society is something which is massive, absolutely vast, way beyond a human scale, quite dysfunctional, quite riven. And what I see as likely in a situation where, you know, we've kept on thinking that there were lines in the sand. You know, many of us thought, you know, Katrina was a line in the sand, COP26 and so on. And when each of these lines gets crossed, you know, there's a bit more of a consciousness shift, and there's a few more people who come our way and so on. But is there going to be this kind of Czechoslovakia moment? What I think is more likely is that we get more of these people coming. The climate movement is definitely going to grow during the 20s, probably exponentially, as things, you know, tragically continue to spiral downwards, the weather continues to go out of control. Where are those people going to go? You know, I think some of them are going to come and join, you know, Just Stop Oil or whatever. I think a lot of them, if that's all that they see, as it were, as a viable option, they're not going to go there. And some of them may indeed go, therefore, to some quite unpleasant places, like towards eco-fascism. What we want, one of the crucial things we need to do, maybe we'll come in a minute to the question of, you know, how do we get relatively conservative people potentially on board? How do we get people who are not woke on board? One of the things that crucially seems to me we need to do is to appeal to people in a slightly more bottom-up way, which is not individualistic, not just about small groups, but is about meeting people in a certain important sense where they are. And where are people? I think people are mostly in two real places. They're mostly in their communities where they live, and they're in the places where they work. And there they have a real group of people around them who in most cases they know and hopefully trust, and so on and so forth. And what I'm trying to say is, what if we got people in those places taking the kind of actions that government ought to be taking, but just isn't? And of course, this is not to say, oh, let's forget about government totally, it's a lost cause. Not at all. Politics matters, government matters, absolutely. It would be then about kind of, among other things, shaming government into taking the right kind of action. And one of the crucial things that businesses need to do is they need to change what they lobby for. Mostly now, most businesses still lobby for, loopholes and regulatory exemptions and so on. Mm-hmm. We need them to be lobbying for a higher level playing field that cuts out the climate and green bad guys. And that's one of the crucial ways that they can make a difference. How do we get to that point? You say we get to that point through changing things, through civil resistance and this kind of flip, maybe. But I think that also probably we get to that point through trying to catalyze them directly and to working on them through their employees, through people who are climate aware in those workplaces, etc. To get to the point where, for example, we get people in workplaces saying, unless you do this, we're going to start doing half-hour work stoppages. And that kind of thing happening in specific industries and in specific institutions. Maybe eventually it might happen as a sort of, potential climate general strike. But I think that's the kind of thing that has to be built up to. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not going to be, I don't think, a sudden flip towards that.
Yeah, well, I do.
Interesting.
So, and I say, I'm saying that not from a normative or ideological point of view. I'm saying it from an analytical point of view, that the thing's too far gone. Thing's too far gone for this change to happen with any, the only way it's going to happen is through massive disruption on lots of different levels. And I mean, let me be a bit nuanced about it. It's not like one morning everything's the same, there's civil resistance, and the next morning everything changes. No, that's ridiculous, right? What I'm talking about is a series of fundamental breaks, economically, politically, spiritually, with the old regime, right? So it's more like the fall of the Roman Empire. It's like, but in 2 years, right?
Yeah,
it's like
the Roman Empire took a very long time.
Exactly. But what we know from the Roman Empire was, things were pretty, things looked pretty okay, like on the surface, and then there was a massive collapse, and then they pulled it all back together again, and then there was another massive collapse, right? And it's a bit like a stock market collapse, there's there's several cliff faces. So there will be like counter movements, but obviously by the fascist right and all the rest of it. This isn't going to be you wake up in the morning and everyone's being nice, right? We're looking, maybe you are looking, but it's going to come with cliff faces. Because of this herding mechanism, and this history is full of these episodes. The reason why probably a lot of people watching us don't believe me, as it were, because we've had our cultural experiences, everything's trundling along, it's trundling along. But the fact of the matter is, the last 30 years have been a unique period in European history, in world history. There's been no massive confrontations in a classical sense, right? I mean, there's been loads of injustice
but what
and
about
change.
Where is this line, you see? This is what I don't see. So John Michael Greer, for example, argues, collapses normally do take a long time. What's going to be this thing that prompts this kind of once and for all kind of herding shift? You and I agree, our civilization cannot go on as it is. It is going to be transformed. I think that the transformation is going to happen quite a lot more quickly than Greer thinks. But I'm sceptical that it's going to happen quite as quickly as you think. Because of
social repression. That's the theory, right? So that's why you have to have this Freudian-esque analysis, right? You're in the therapy session, the guy's going, no, everything's fine, I'm fine. On session 7, he collapses into a heap of tears, right? Why is that? Because the social repression is building up, and
but isn't this happening sort of sequentially? That's what I was saying. If some people wake up, COP26 fails, a bunch more people wake up.
No, it's not. It's not sequential. It's all at once. It's all at once. I mean, not all at once in some absolutist sense, right? In other words, like with Insulate Britain, right, look upon this as a social repression analysis, right? In Insulate Britain, let's say for the sake of argument, there were 10 million conversations in the UK about Insulate Britain, right? I mean, 3 in 4 people knew about it. Those conversations, let's say for the sake of argument, were 90% negative. It's like, what the hell are they doing? They're blocking motorways. You know, we've got a right to get to work. Everything's fine. Who are these people? They're hippies, you know, blah, 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 right? From a Freudian point of view, that's a stage in this flipping process that at some point, and it's extremely difficult to predict from a complexity point of view, you know, we know it's coming, but we don't know when. Although the fact that there was 90% of people actually animated about it is a predictor that at some point 50-60% of them will change in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Right?
I don't see it. I do not see it. I mean, let's look at Extinction Rebellion. I think that most of what Extinction Rebellion has done has been really good. I think some of it, especially, you know, a lot of what we did in the April 2019 rebellion has been brilliant. I think that Extinction Rebellion was fatally wounded by what happened at Canning Town. I think Extinction Rebellion has never recovered from that, and I'm not sure it ever will. And maybe Extinction Rebellion will really recover from that in 2 or 3 years' time. That, you know, there'll be moments in the 2020s when things are so fucking awful, and there'll be climate disasters and so forth, and food shortages probably that are so terrible that there'll be a lot more people waking up. Maybe, you know, XR will be able to be the thing that kind of says at that moment, hey, look, we're still here, and we've been proved, you know, if only you'd kind of come to us 5 years ago, that's totally possible. And again, that's the kind of thing I hope will happen. But I think it's really clear, objectively clear, and I think you have to learn from these mistakes, that Canning Town really set Extinction Rebellion back. Now, I'm a bit worried that you could sort of turn any of these kinds of negatives into a positive. You could say, well, lots of people spoke about Canning Town, therefore, you know, in the end, it's kind of okay. I don't see that. And I
no,
don't
well,
see it
that's the
with
problem,
Richard.
is we agree on the empirics, but we don't agree on the interpretation of the empirics. That's the problem with different paradigms of interpretation. You see what I mean? If you have a surface rational way of looking at it, and I'm not saying it's absolute, you know, I'm not saying that analysis is.
But there's a risk that your
wrong.
approach is sort of unfalsifiable, isn't there? There's a risk that
Yeah,
you say,
yeah.
the worse it gets, the better it gets.
It's very difficult. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. I mean, I'm all into criticism, right, as you know, right?
Yeah.
I like to look at the numbers. You know, I go into work every day, as it were, and I'm looking at the mobilisation numbers, and I'm working about the microdynamics of how to mobilise people and all the rest of it. So I'm not denigrating that, but we have to accept the fact there's a fundamental difference of analysis here, right? And there's good empirical evidence for both, as you might say, but we don't know. Because I can't prove to you, because I can't get into those people's heads.
Yeah.
But just because I can't get into those people's heads doesn't mean that I'm wrong. I can't prove it. It's unprovable. Yeah. But, you know, I can, let me give you another example, right? Black Lives Matter started, I think it was around 2012, right?
Yeah.
And there was a big, you know, upsurgence of it. And then, you know, nothing, it went several years.
Absolutely.
Do you remember when it was like, oh, Black Lives Matter, that was, those people, and what's happened to them? I haven't seen very much. And then, you know, the guy was shot in, whenever it was, in America. Why was that?
Absolutely.
Because of social repression amongst young people and amongst people of colour. It was like, that's the line. And suddenly you've got 10,000 arrests in the USA, and in 3 or 4 weeks, you've got state legislators going, okay, what do you want?
Totally agree, and that's the kind of thing I had in mind with XR. There could be a moment like that where XR sort of really comes back, and XR actually gets millions. I think that could happen in, you know, a couple of years' time or something. But I also think that we need to understand that XR could have put itself in a better position to be ready for that moment if it hadn't alienated so many people by, for example, doing Canning Town. As I say, my concern about your approach is that it can look as though anything that you do that gets publicity or gets people talking is good, and however bad your public image, it's good.
No, I'm not saying that, just for the record.
Right, good.
I'm saying it's problematic, right?
Yeah.
Causing disruption is problematic, and it's probabilistic, right, in whether it's going to be effective or not. It's not like, do this and it will cause that, right? You don't know. But there's absolutely a point of where you're going too far, particularly when you're denigrating people, like verbally, and obviously when you start moving into violence or
Yes.
and what have you. So, without sounding too sort of reductive about it, it's like 8 out of 10, right? It's 1 out of 10 is vaguely concerned. 4 out of 10 is go on a march. 8 out of 10 is 10 weeks of 3,000 people causing civil resistance. 9 out of 10 is blowing up pipelines, and 10 out of 10 is shooting the Prime Minister, right? You see what I mean? Like, it very rapidly collapses. There's a cliff edge. In my analysis, there's a cliff edge where if you go over that cliff edge, then you're basically into civil war.
Yes.
Right? That's not what I'm interested in.
No, absolutely.
What I'm interested in is the mainstay of classical nonviolence as originated through Gandhi and Martin Luther King, which creates a probabilistic analysis that you could be successful. And my final point on this, because I think we should move on, is it's not that this is a guarantee. This is the important thing. Many of your criticisms have a validity, but that's not the point. The point is this methodology has a far higher level of probability of creating a change in the next 3 years than what you call a moderate frank. But let me just finish by saying, there is some common ground because we both acknowledged it's a sociological inevitability that there is a moderate frank flank, right?
Yes.
It's there, but that doesn't mean, my argument is that doesn't mean you normatively support it. So as a pragmatic common ground, as it were, I think what both of us should be saying, or what I think you should be saying, is civil resistance is what we morally and strategically are called to do at this point in history, right? And I know that not all of you are going to do it, but this is what we're morally and strategically obliged to do as parents, as adults, as human beings, right?
Interesting.
And if you're not doing it, then obviously you're going to be creating these other organisations, then so be it. And then you're right that those other organisations shouldn't be engaged in some reductive 1950s male rationalist sort of discourse. They should be creating, as we both agree, they should be creating spaces for emotional communication and small-scale direct actions. That's all well and good. And the last thing I say is we would just stop oil. I think what's interesting would just stop oil is potentially we are making alliances with the moderate flank in so much as we're saying we're going for this, right? Inevitably, not all of you are going to follow us. You should normatively, but sociologically you're not. But that doesn't mean we're going to not work with you. What we want is the lawyers to come in. They should be in the road, but they're not. But what they can do and what they will do is potentially make a public statement saying British constitutional, culture does not involve arresting and putting into prison people who are trying to save their children's lives. That's a complete contradiction of British political tradition, British culture, and all the rest of it, which we all know. So maybe that's,
This
sort
is
of
nice because it
fusion.
seems to me we're getting quite close to each other now, which is always good. I'm saying we need the 8 out of 10 and we need the 7 out of 10, which is my new just behind the radical flank, moderate flank, and like with regard to Just Stop Oil, for example, I'll probably be asked to comment on it, and I will say things like, look, these people are doing the kind of thing that is necessary if we're going to make the kind of changes we need to in the kind of time that we're going to make. If you are going to be in a position to criticize them, you need to be actually doing something that is at least as good, if not better. Now, what is that thing? And then I'll talk about what some of the other things are that people can and should be doing through the law, through their businesses, etc., etc. And in terms of, obviously, you and I have both been engaging in civil resistance. And when I do have these conversations with people, I often try to persuade someone who is already, for example, someone who's run a big NGO or something. I say it would be really powerful if you would go and do some nonviolent direct action. And if you would thereby kind of saying, actually, you know what? Friends of the Earth and the Green Party, they're great, but they are not enough. We have to be going further than that. For me, what it's really about, it's about taking everybody to the edge of their comfort zone and then one step beyond, so far as that one step beyond stays the doing of something which is strategic and strategically intelligent. And so with some people, it's about getting them to the point of voting green. For other people, it's about getting them to the point of taking action in their workplace, or maybe even threatening to withhold their labour. For other people, it's about will you come and block this oil refinery? And if we're moving as large a numbers as we can, as it were, sort of up this beautiful treadmill, then we're maybe working together in such a way that we create this ecosystem of the movement, or of the movement of movements, which can actually function well.
Yeah, I think we're half agreed.
Yeah.
Well, I quite like that summary. That, I like to concretize things. When you're talking, there's a big difference between going to a moderate flank space and saying, you're the moderate flank, that's the sociological reality, and therefore that's okay, and carry on. That's what I don't want. What I think our middle ground is you going to the moderate flank space and saying, you're the moderate flank, that's the sociological reality, and we have the agency, and you have the agency, and you have the moral responsibility to step up. Right? I'm challenging you.
Yeah.
In other words, you're not coming across as making the reality a normative proposition.
And don't make them just kind of feel good. People need to be continually being brought out of their comfort zone.
Yeah, it's not a pleasant process. We all know that. I mean, we all interrogate ourselves all the time. So but welcome to real life, isn't it? It's like this. It's not. It's not. The party's over.
Should we turn for a minute to think about how this applies to being as genuinely inclusive as we can? Because this is part of the reason why I put forward this moderate flank idea. But one of the interesting things about it is it's one area where you and I have made some similar kinds of interventions in terms of trying to say to some of our colleagues in the movement, look, one of the things that we may be uncomfortable with, but we actually have to try to do, is to speak to people who do not share our politics, is to really be serious about moving beyond party politics and appealing, for example, to small c conservatives, is to make sure that people who are not signed up to an intersectionalist identity politics agenda don't feel by virtue of that excluded from the climate movement, is therefore to be able to say to people, you don't have to think of yourself as woke to wake up to this crisis and this permanent emergency that we're in, and actually step up to the plate and do something serious about it. How are you seeing that at this point, Roger, as we move into 2022, just end oil, the kind of post COP26 world? How can we get more traction? And by we here, I mean you and me, in terms of having this kind of difficult conversation with some of the people who might be watching this video? Well,
it's a really interesting challenge, I think, because as I said initially, there's one of the major confusions around the climate crisis is the nature of the political, to use a slightly technical turn of phrase. But there's this very strong argument that there's bad guys out there, they're doing bad things, and we are going to be in solidarity and overcome them and force through change. So that's the traditional left-wing political orientation. It has this certain logic. People say that you have to politicize it. In other words, you have to make it a space of social conflict, right? And of course, they're half right? So this is nuanced, okay? Don't jump to black and white. I'm going to unpack that a little bit, because yes, there are bad people doing bad things, absolutely. And yes, absolutely, there has to be social conflict, right? Because that's how political change works. And at the same time, the objective reality of the situation is this is not fundamentally a question of interests. It's a question of human survival.
There's a sense in which we really are all in it together.
There's a sense, and I think what we're trying to say here, before we get, pigeonholed, is it's a sense. In other words, it's not an absolutist reality. No. It's not like saying all that's out there is human race, They either survive or they don't. That's ridiculous. That's an element of what we face. Another element of it is the social inequality. And some people are going to die before other people.
Yeah.
That's absolutely correct as well. So there's the two things. So the correct analysis is there's both.
Yeah, totally
and
agree.
therefore, you can't totally go over to one or totally go over to the other. So it's, yes, the political is important, but it's not the only show, it's not the only game in town in terms of valid analysis.
Yeah.
There's another valid analysis or another analysis that has to enter into the frame, which is this, as we, to continue our analogy, it's the World War II Popular Front analysis, which is we are facing something which is so supremely evil, so supremely, ugly, unjust, that anyone who has any semblance of common decency, any attachment to human values, has to be absolutely appalled, objectively, And what that means is that's an opening to people who have, I'm going to call it, different cultural orientations. That's a broad description, right? I don't want to get reduced into going, how do we appeal to right-wingers? Like, as soon as you construct it like that, it's like you're back to that old style binary politics, there's the right-wing people and there's left-wing people. That's really reductive crap politics, right? I mean, it's got some validity, but it's not the only game in town. The fact of the matter is, as you probably know, most individuals in society only think about politics 5 minutes a week, right? What it means to be human is to have all sorts of orientations. Sometimes you're political, sometimes you're spiritual, sometimes you're cultural, you have you flip between different things, and then within those self-identities, you have internal conflicts. You have, I'm a conservative, but I'm not quite sure about that. And, I mean, you just had that MP that's flipped out, and joined the Labour Party yesterday. I mean, it's a classic example that there's more going on in the human psyche than, this reductive left-wing analysis of the world. There's people that is unequal and there's people against equality and people, for it. That's absolutely a critical part of describing the social space, but it's not the only thing that's going on. For instance, fear of death. That's not political, right? But it's a massive part of the human experience. And we know, for instance, just concretise it before I start. I've talked to conservatives with a little c, let's say, or let's say people with a conservative culture. And let's acknowledge that there's people on the left with conservative cultures. They want society to stay the same. They want to go to the pub and have a pint. They're not particularly interested in various, issues which young people bring up, blah, 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 rightly or wrongly. There's all those people out there. And when I go and talk with them, right, this is in my strategy is I'm listening to them, I'm repeating back. So I create, like you say, a rapport, right? You've got to create this rapport. And then you can, without sounding too manipulative, the fact of the matter is once you've made the rapport, you can start deconstructing the contradictions within their position, within their own frame. And, just
so bringing out how, for example, conservatism ought to mean things like conservation.
Well, it's in the name, guys. It's like, you're a conservative and so you're going to destroy the human race. Like, that doesn't really fit together, does it? With all due respect. It's like, and there's, to expand that a little bit, in the left-wing space, there's structural contradictions. Let's face it, there's a big contradictions between freedom and equality, for instance, which have a long lineage and no one quite knows how to sort that out. But in the conservative space, there's structural contradictions, and the central structural contradiction of conservatism, widely defined, is you're into capitalism, you're into the free market, you're into people making money, you're into people getting on in their life, well, maybe fair enough, and capitalism is destroying family values, social values, community. Well, that's a problem, because the other side of the conservative equation is we just want to go to the pub and have a pint. We want things to stay the same, rightly or wrongly. So that's the cleaverage, I think, in this strategy with the broadly defined conservative space is...
Agreed,
Yeah.
agreed. And so we might say that with conservatives, typically the Achilles heel is the free market dogma, which stands in the way of achieving the other values. With people on the left, my experience is that typically the analogous problem is a dogma of progress, dogma of endless kind of human progress, typically expressed through notions of endless economic growth and distribution of equal distribution of an ever-widening pie, and that's how you get to these kind of completely absurd ideas like fully automated luxury communism, which I think is a disastrous thing to be aiming for, because it would be ecologically
Well, it'd be nice if it wasn't for climate change.
It'd be nice if it was possible, but it's completely not possible. So
Sorry,
yeah,
I missed that one.
Yeah.
that possibility is no longer on the table.
Sadly
guys.
so. Yeah, I mean, to come back to what we were saying earlier about the Second World War, it seems to me that's the great precedent here. So Popular Front, also the concept of a national government, which can be quite appealing to people on the right potentially. And the point being, when so earlier I was saying, look, there's some real disanalogies between our situation and the Second World War, but there's also these real analogies, and they're profoundly important. If we can appeal to people in terms of what is necessary, then they may be able to start to see how some of the things that they are committed to, the dogma of progress, the dogma of endless growth, the dogma of free market for folk on the right, they may start to see how some of those things are actually getting in the way of their other values. Now, this is difficult, and this is going to involve people in complex processes of kind of reassessment and retrenchment and so on. But I guess what you and I both think is this is possible, and certainly if we are going to achieve the kind of shift, whether it's as quick as you think or a little bit slower as I think, but the transformative shift that is coming, if we don't get the kind that we want, we're going to get the collapsing kind that we don't want.
I think this is the critical dynamite point. It's not like, let's choose between two options. There's only one option, which is complete transformation.
Yeah.
You're either going to get it brutally, or you're going to get it through some democratic, deliberative form.
Yeah.
The status quo is no longer
the prolongation of that is not an option.
And then you've got this. This is the critical point where I think I'm going to suggest they're going to flip, of course, to continue my analysis. The flip point is when they go, by pursuing capitalism, I'm actually going to destroy it. In other words, like the old paradigm is, I'm a capitalist, I'm a right winger. I think free market's great. I think capitalism's great because it's going to promote capitalism and it's going to promote my values. You over there are trying to destroy capitalism, and you're trying to stop people, getting on with their lives, and blah blah blah. We know that. That's fairyland, right? The reality is, I either go through fundamental transformation, and capitalism's got to go through a fundamental transformation, i.e., there has to be a socialistic explosion in the space. In other words, like you said, you put it very well at the beginning. When people in World War II agreed to a socialistic orientated society, that's not because they were socialists. It's because if you don't do that, you're going to lose the war.
Yeah.
You have to go into the factories and say, sorry guys, you've got to build tanks. There's no free market here.
No.
We haven't got the time. Hitler's in Dunkirk. Tough.
My favourite story is Roosevelt goes to the American car manufacturers and says to them, right, after Pearl Harbor, right, here's your plans for what you're going to produce in the next few years in terms of, tanks and planes and so on. And they looked at the plans for a while and they said, Mr. President, there must be some mistake here. If we do all this, we won't be able to produce any cars for the next few years. And he's like, yep, you got it.
Yeah. But the key point is this is the critical point. Unless you produce tanks now, you'll never produce any more cars. Ever for the next 100,000 years.
Yeah.
That's the point. I mean, I've talked to one or two Tory MPs, as you know, about this, and this is the point where you can see them grinding away in their brain, which is the more that the old strategy is actually producing the opposite results of what I want. In other words, the more I pursue capitalism, the quicker I'm going to destroy it.
And the quicker I destroy
And that's the flip
freedoms
point
as well.
And the quicker you're going to destroy the freedoms, the quicker you're going to destroy the whole libertarian agenda.
Yeah.
It's a suicidal strategy.
So we've got this like difference still on timescales. I'm skeptical that we're going to get any significant number of right-leaning folks or conservative working class type people, etc., getting into civil resistance anytime soon. I think we can get some into the moderate flank soon. And I think the key point really is that we're agreed in thinking what you absolutely mustn't have is all those people continuing to dogmatically oppose you. You've got to give them ways of at least coming into this sort of soft underbelly of sort of general support, kind of somehow kind of getting it. I don't really want to be doing this, but I realize that actually we kind of have to do something like this because the world has fundamentally changed. We've, at the very least, in terms of my iceberg metaphor, we've got to get quite a lot of these people into the point of being there below the surface, keeping us buoyant, not kind of pulling us down to destruction.
Yeah. Well, that's the other side of this proposition, isn't it? And this is nothing to do with politics. It's about the dynamics of human conflict, which is, if you're not talking to these guys, or rather, if you're not listening to them and in dialogue with them, then you're going to get overpolarization.
Yes.
And people make connections not over political ideology, but over face-to-face human communication. And this is what the left doesn't understand a lot of the time as well, which is most people are not political. Most people are tribal. It's like, I need an identity. I've been provided with an identity by a right-wing ideology, and I'm never going to get out of it through argument. But what I am going to do is, if you come and be decent to me, i.e., let's concretize it, you're going to sit in a room, listen to them, and then evolve, some discussion around their frames. At the end of it, they're going to shake your hand, right? Whatever he's called, Nigel Farage, right? Come off, I was civil with him. I thought he was talking utter bollocks, but it didn't matter. I was in that space. Yeah. He shook hands with me, right?
Yeah, and we also get to have the moral high ground that way, and their attempts to kind of drag us down into a sort of bickering match don't work. The right understand that culture is usually upstream of politics, and I think part of what we're talking about is a civic culture, and the cultural transformation which involves people gradually or not so gradually, increasingly coming to understand this really is it. These criteria for the permanent emergency have to start to trump these things that have felt important to you, but they're not the only things that are important to you, and actually they're not the things that are most important to you.
Yeah. So I think strategically for me, there's two things going on. One is, if you look at all the comments when I went on Nigel Farage, it was like, twat, cunt sort of stuff, right? But there were quite a lot of people going, this guy's a nutter, but I applaud him for having the guts to come and talk to Nigel. So what this provides is this: if we're not going to have civil wars, we're going to have to show our fearless dialogical commitment to the other side, so that they see our humanity. Yeah. And that's going to prevent a degeneration into social violence.
And we really need to be talking to people like Ben Goldsmith, for example, of the Conservative Environment Network, right? He's the kind of guy who is trying to do what he can within the constraints of a sort of conservative ideology to be serious about starting to kind of chip away in this direction. We don't help him by saying things like, all conservatives are wankers, or if you're not woke, you're a wanker, or something. We do help him by being ready to step into the space of talking with him, by sitting down at the table of politics with him, and by starting to kind of make clear, you know what, conservatives really are human beings too, and they have children, and it's through things like that we can start to form common ground with them, while keeping in mind what I thought you put very well, Roger, the kind of two realities of at one and the same time, we are all in this together, and we are not all in this together. We are not all as equal as each other. Both are true, and we need to try to sort of take people from this side over to this side as much as we can, and get them to understand that the more they stay on this side, the more fucked we all are, because there is no future that is as radically unequal as the future we have now. It's just not possible.
Yeah.
It's just not possible to have people continuing to, use private jets en masse, etc., and actually have a future.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously we're agreeing with each other too much here. So I'm going to say something a little bit. I hate these videos where people go, "Yeah, you're right," and "Oh, we're all agreed." It's so boring, isn't it? It's this whole I
think we've had this thread of disagreement.
Yeah, we've had quite a lot of disagreement. That's good. But I'm just going to throw a little curveball into your, which connects with our previous disagreement, which is, I think something that's quite interesting and counterintuitive is it's not the moderate green conservatives that are actually going to make this shift, right?
Okay.
This is an empirical observation in the sense that, if it's not true, it's not true. But what I've noticed is a lot of the light green conservatives are actually neoliberal liberals. They actually still buy in to this whole fantasy of growth. And what they're saying is we can have growth, but we can have a little bit of greenery here and there, right? And they count, how people are. If people have that ideology, they're not going to get out of it without too much difficulty. Now, I want to identify. So I think we need to be smart about the conservative space. It's intellectually lazy to just go, that's the conservatives and they're bad. It's like, no. We need to be smarter. We need to be thinking, okay, which are the different subtribes in the conservative space? And I'm talking not about the Conservative Party necessarily.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the broader cultural space. There's this other group, and this other group has no interest in the environment, right? And they're what I would call one nation conservatives.
Yes.
It's like, it's humanity, it's bringing on the nation.
Heritage.
It's heritage, it's the nation, it's patriotism, it's not necessary, it's not vicious, let's have enough nuance. These aren't fascists, they're one nation conservatives. They fought in Second World War against So again, we need to be nuanced on that as well. But the thing about that group, and the thing why I think it's that group that's going to flip, and I'm going to say flip, is because they're intelligent enough to know that capitalism is not God, right? They're intelligent enough because their culture tells them, their tradition tells them that, as Adam Smith says, you don't allow the merchant class to take over the state. Because the merchant class is great at producing wealth, it's not that cool at ruling because it fundamentally believes in the private interest. And the conservative anti-capitalist tradition, as it were, is the state is the main show. And you need the state to discipline capitalism, otherwise the whole thing collapses, right? It's a completely respectable view in the longer stream of conservative thought. So what my proposition to you, and I've actually talked to some of these guys, so it's not like I'm making this up, and this is what they're thinking about is, oh fuck, we're going to destroy Britain. Oh my God. 1.5 is the collapse of a global trading system for a start. That's not going to be too good for a trading nation. Number two is the whole infrastructure is going to collapse at 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees. That means, we're looking at London out of this window, aren't we?
Yeah.
And it's like, what is it? 25 to 50% of the housing stock of London's going to be subsiding by 2050? That's not a one nation conservative orientation. And what I'm predicting, and this is the game plan, is that those people will flip. In other words, it will be the realists. It will be the old-fashioned realists. And as you may know, I've talked to this guy who did his book called, I've forgotten his name now, Climate Change and the Nation State. And the knee-jerk reaction is, he's a nationalist, and I'm not saying he's God or anything, but he's making a really important point, which is part of this alliance is going to involve patriotic conservatives who are sceptical or even utterly opposed to global capitalism. And that's going to have to be part. That's the same as that radical socialist having to be in the trenches with a conservative Catholic, right? It's like, who is that guy? I hate him, but we're going to have to do this together. And this is part of avoiding the Civil War scenario.
Interesting. Yeah, I think there might be a both and. So yeah, you've got the sort of red Tory thing, you've got Disraeli, and then you've got people like, I used to debate and dialogue with Roger Scruton, who thought of himself as a green conservative, and he was interested in conservative philosophy. And there are elements of conservative philosophy which are completely potentially able to point in the kind of direction that we want here. You know, there's some elements of conservative philosophy which are about people hanging on to their money, which are not so brilliant. But there are elements which are to do with conservation, which are to do with being able to continue the kind of way of life that we've had, that can be appealed to as a basis for being green. And as you say, my analysis for many years has been that the real problem has been the takeover by neoliberalism of conservatism and, of course, to a large extent, of the Labour Party.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is a fracture, you know, like the conventional political space. It's like a what's it called? A straitjacket, right?
Yeah.
It's like you have to be left wing, you have to be right wing, and you can see the logic because you know you have a solidarity logic. Is everyone's got to stay together, and you know that logic's got a lot going for it. But it's got this dark side, which is it corrupts itself.
Yeah.
It's like, you've got a really good idea. No, we're not having new ideas. Or, there's a little bit of a fracture there. Oh, no, we've got to paper over that fracture. But the fact of the matter is, you know, political and social change, sociologically, is all about new fractures in society. You know, it used to be church and state, then it was left wing and right wing. What I think the fracture in the 21st century is not that those are going away. The left wing, right wing, it's not going to go away, but it's not going to be the only game in town. No. And arguably the biggest game in town is ecological realism and neoliberal fantasy.
Good.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
And we all know, let's be honest with ourselves, let's be honest with our audience here, the left wing space is full of anti-nature, imperialistic arrogance.
Yeah.
It's like the world's out there, the natural world's out there, and we can shit on it, we can rape on it, we can raid it, and we don't care.
Yeah, it's anthropocentrism run wild.
It is.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the root, the neoliberal root goes back to the Enlightenment, does it not? We know this, right? Saying everything's centred around the human race, and we know, you know, it had a good side to it, which is we want humanity to get richer, and that's all, but it has this distinctive dark side to it, which is the denigration of the world outside the human space.
Okay.
And that's suicidal in 2022.
Totally agreed, and that's a lovely kind of place at which to maybe head towards a conclusion here. We're talking now about a sort of bigger kind of post-anthropocentric vision, which is taking what we can take from the Enlightenment, but leaving the dark side of the Enlightenment behind. We said when we started that we might try to end this with just a few minutes on thinking about, well, how is what the kind of thing that we're talking about here and the kind of stuff that we've tried to be doing and still are, how is it going to be seen historically? If there are people to write history in 2100 or 2200, what kinds of things are they going to say? And if you're watching this, you know, you may well be a rebel, or you may be someone who's just waking up on climate or whatever. You're thinking, what am I getting involved with here? What this movement or movements that we're talking about here, how are they going to appear to posterity? So, you know, what can we say about, what words of wisdom can we leave our viewers with on this, Roger, as we draw towards a close here?
I don't think we should say words of wisdom. That's a little bit presumptive, isn't it?
In philosophy, I'm a philosopher. We try to
deluded, individualistic fantasies have we got?
In philosophy, we try to seek wisdom. That's the beauty of the etymology of the word philosophy.
Oh, right, okay.
Wisdom.
That sounds a little bit. That sounds a little bit more self-depreciative, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it could all be bollocks, couldn't it? But who knows? But well, I just want to throw in something I've been thinking about last fortnight. I think this is an interesting perspective. I never can remember any names, but basically, people think it's weird. But I've been watching these videos from a Catholic theologian, dare I say it. And it's interesting, at times of rapid political change, you know, the people with the greatest wisdom are often people outside the space, traditions which have been denigrated. And, you know, I've always been interested in Catholic social thought. I'm not buying it, right? Don't get me wrong, right? I'm not going to become a Catholic. But there's something in that tradition which I think's really wise. And what she's saying, to somewhat simplify, is the question here, you know, in the green space, there's this idea, there's this orthodoxy that the transformation is that we're going to make our peace with nature. We're going to realize we're part of nature. We're going to treat nature, you know, well, and it's all going to be hunky-dory, right?
Yeah.
Because we're integrated, right? And, you know, it's got stuff going for it. So I'm not, but I think there's another sort of transformatory thing, which I think is arguably deeper, which is, and what this theologian was saying is, and, you know, lots of people have said this, guys, like, the problem isn't nature. That nature's fine. Nature's going to be carrying on for the next 4 billion years, right?
Yeah.
The problem is the fucking human race, guys. It's like, what the hell are we going to make of ourselves?
Yes.
And that question, what does it mean to be human? I mean, we're not going to. I just want to say,
we're not going to sort that.
I don't. You know, my day job is where to put the biscuits on the table, you know, when people come into the mobilisation meeting. So I'm just allowing myself some speculation here for the last 10 minutes, right? You know, but this is my speculative proposition, is that once you ask that meta question, which is, what is it about humans that makes us want to destroy ourselves? Because that's how we should frame it. It's not like we're destroying nature. You know, no, we are nature. We are destroying ourselves, and nature's going to carry on.
Yeah.
So really, the focus should not necessarily, or exclusively anyway, be on our relationship to nature. The real question is, who is it? What is it to be human?
Yeah.
And then that opens up a whole new literature, existentialism, you know, religious theology, you know, wisdom traditions, indigenous traditions. And we need to bring those in to this key question. And in some ways, this is a really amazing opportunity, without sounding too hippie about it, for us to transform ourselves as the human race.
Absolutely.
But we no longer want to hate ourselves and hate each other to the extent of human extinction. That we're going to come back from that, because let's face it, right? You know, there's plenty of literature on this. Human beings do hate themselves. They hate existence. They hate each other. They kill each other. They kill themselves. You know, we've got this dark side, and there's good reasons for it, right? I mean, we're thrown into existence. We've got all these instincts. We've got, you know, these passions. We get life disappointments. People we love die. Tragedy happens. Then we've got to die. It's not great. Whoever put us into this position has got something to answer for, right? So what Catholic social thought is, and all these wisdom traditions, are really ways of constructing the human, which gives us a break.
Yeah, I like that.
You know what I mean? On some level,
I do,
saying, you know, it's actually okay. Let's love each other a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of reference points for me there. One would be the Pope and Cardinal Turkson, who wrote the Laudato Si, which is a really great document of ecological thinking and spiritual thinking at the same time. Another, I've just read David Graeber's last book, The Dawn of Everything, which I'd really recommend to people as a wonderful sort of hymn to human agency and to the potentiality that we can remake ourselves and remake our societies and our institutions, which is a kind of optimism of the will that I think we need at this moment in history. So building on what you said there, Roger, which I think is really, really very profound, frankly, actually. I think you've done a bit of wisdom seeking there successfully. I would say...
I read it all in a book.
Yeah, I'd say this. I'd say we can, I think, know that if, as seems at least possible, we are part of achieving this transformation that has to come, that history will judge us kindly. But there's two really crucial ways that we can't know how history will judge us. And they're these. Firstly, if there is going to be this transformation, which is going to be paradigmatic and wide and deep and ultimately ethical and spiritual, people in the future are probably going to have somewhat different values and ways of seeing things from us. And the way they look back, it's going to be from a position that is quite different from the position that we currently inhabit. And the second way we can't know how history will judge us is that, and this is the building on the point specifically that you made, we are going to change in the process, in getting towards that. And the most crucial part of the change of all, arguably, is who are we going to be right now? You know, who are we prepared to be? How are we prepared to step up or not right now? And that is going to change us. That is going to be a process of transformation. That is a sense in which people who say you've got to be the change you want to see in the world are right. That is connected with the way that getting involved in something like Extinction Rebellion is and is experienced as being transformative and prefigurative for people who do it. It's, you know, that's very widely experienced, I think. So that's something that's kind of, I think, quite exciting and encouraging about kind of the context in which this kind of discussion that we've been trying to have should be seen. That ultimately this is about who are we going to be, who are we prepared to be, what is humanity going to mean as it gets manifested by us at this moment.
Yeah, and I think another major challenge to our culture is this infantile notion that suffering is simplistically bad. You know, that obviously who wants anyone to suffer? It's a no-brainer. That's not what we're saying. Yeah. What we're saying is in the human experience, the pathway to wisdom is suffering. You know, inevitable suffering that life involves. And we should get out of this idea that social conflict, you know, despair, depression, all these things are simplistically bad. What in the human experience, they're pathways to what I would call the destruction of the ego. You know, you hate yourself, you hate the world, you have an existential moment where you go, do I want to live like this, or do I want to renew myself in humility, knowing I'm a shit? You see what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
And you see this all the time, you know, which one of the reasons why people have had a hard life are actually very wise, is because they know they're rubbish. You know, they know they've fucked up, and they know they've gone through this extremity of despair about themselves and about the world. And I'm not fetishizing it, right? Because we all know that can lead to suicide and violence and all the rest of it. And at the same time, it provides the potentiality, and arguably, it's an essential process of psychic, social, individual change, where people go, I'm now in service. I get, you know, this is what keeps me going anyway. And I know it's sort of for other activists that work really hard. It's like, we get up in the morning, we're in service to the common good. And that's it. If the whole thing collapses, I'm not going to take that on my shoulders. You know, if I don't succeed, then so be it. I've not succeeded on so much in my life. I'm not out to succeed fundamentally. I'm out to get up in the morning and use all my gifts and faculties to try and save humanity. And that's the miracle. This, you know, this is why we need to revisit our theological, religious, and spiritual traditions. Not because we're going to become some 14th century Catholic, right? And make a nuanced point, but so that we can start to rediscover the intensity of what it means to be human, other than this superficial bollocks we've been sold for 30 years that, you know, we work, we spend money, we consume, and that's all there is to it. It's not, is it? No. So, you know, that's the, for me, like, that's the invitation to people is it's about us as individuals. It's not like about saving the world. That's what I'm trying to say. Obviously it is on one level, but it's fundamentally about what sort of human being do you want to be? Do you want to be true to yourself?
Fundamentally agreed. Great to end on a point of agreement, and I hope that people take away from this the sense of how you can disagree respectfully, and maybe this has been a little bit about what it's like to be a human being, and to be able to appreciate it amidst all the the horrors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I've tried to sort of allude to in this, in this session with you, is there's this rational level of we're having an argument, we're disagreeing with each other, but really the most fundamental point about this session is we're sitting down talking to each other. That's the main communication in a way to this audience, and what we're doing is modelling what humanity at its best hopefully is, which is people are always going to disagree, and I do fundamentally disagree with you, right? Let's not beat around the bush. It's important, and at the same time, we have enough humanity in common that we're going to sit down and and map it out, right?
Yeah,
map it out.
And hopefully, you all watching this can continue to model that yourselves. We hope the comments on this video might be respectful. That'd be something to hope for. And we hope that you'll find this useful in the important work that we know that many of you are trying to do along with us at this difficult and fantastic time. Roger.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much, everyone.